Have you ever paused and wondered why some moments in life feel heavier than others? Not because of what's happening physically, but because of what's quietly being communicated beneath the surface. Many people believe intimacy is purely physical. They assume it starts and ends with attraction, chemistry, and the body. Yet, the deeper reality is far more layered. Intimacy begins in the mind before it ever becomes physical. It is a quiet exchange of trust, emotion, and energy between two individuals. What many men don't fully realize is that for a woman, these moments are rarely just about desire. They represent vulnerability and emotional exposure. In those quiet spaces where two people connect deeply, something far more meaningful is being evaluated. She isn't only responding to your actions, she is responding to who you are, your composure, your presence, your emotional control. These communicate more than words ever could, because in moments of closeness, social masks tend to slip away. The image someone presents to the world fades, leaving their authentic emotional character behind. Women often sense this instinctively. They may not always explain it logically, but they feel it. They observe tone, body language, and the steadiness of your energy. This is why intimacy often becomes a psychological test without anyone openly calling it one. And if you've ever felt confused by relationships, if you've ever wondered why attraction can suddenly deepen or disappear without explanation, if you've ever experienced a moment where someone seemed emotionally close to you one day and distant the next, then this conversation is for you. Because most people are taught how to attract attention, but very few are taught how to create emotional safety, emotional depth, and genuine connection. And the truth is, those are the things people remember. Long after physical attraction fades, people remember how you made them feel emotionally. So as you watch this, I want you to think about your own experiences. Have you ever been around someone who looked confident on the outside, but somehow made you feel emotionally uneasy? Or maybe you've met someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone, yet their calm presence instantly made you trust them. Let me know in the comments, because these subtle emotional dynamics shape relationships far more than most people realize. And if you're someone who enjoys psychology, emotional intelligence, and understanding human behavior on a deeper level, make sure you subscribe, because these conversations are designed to help you see people and yourself more clearly. You know what's fascinating? Most emotional attraction happens silently. Not through dramatic declarations or perfect words, but through tiny signals the nervous system picks up automatically. A pause before someone speaks, the steadiness of their voice during tension, their ability to stay emotionally grounded when emotions rise. These details may seem small, but psychologically, they carry enormous weight. Human beings are constantly reading each other beneath conscious awareness. Researchers in attachment psychology often explain that emotional security influences attraction more deeply than appearance alone. That means your emotional energy, your consistency, your emotional discipline, all become part of the experience someone has around you. And once you understand this, you stop viewing intimacy as performance and start understanding it as emotional communication. Sarah, host of What She Thinks YouTube channel. In today's video, we're exploring 5 powerful psychological truths about intimacy through a Stoic lens. Not the romantic fantasy people usually discuss, but the deeper emotional dynamics shaping attraction, trust, and connection. These insights are grounded in human psychology and emotional intelligence. Once you understand them, your perspective on relationships begins to shift. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far this community of observers and thinkers has spread. Let's begin with the first truth, because the first thing intimacy reveals to a woman is something most men overlook: emotional safety. Before we go deeper, it's important to understand something many people completely miss. Emotional safety is not the same thing as being nice. A man can be polite, generous, even charming, and still make a woman feel emotionally unsafe. Why? Because safety isn't built through surface behavior. It's built through emotional consistency. Think about it this way. Imagine a woman sitting across from 2 different men. The first man is charismatic, loud, and constantly trying to impress her. He talks over her occasionally, becomes irritated when challenged, and subtly seeks validation every few minutes. The second man speaks calmly. He listens without rushing to respond. He doesn't need to dominate the conversation. His reactions feel measured. His emotional state doesn't swing wildly depending on whether he's being praised or questioned. Now here's the interesting part. Even if both men are physically attractive, most women will instinctively feel more emotionally relaxed around the second man. Why? Because the nervous system is always scanning for stability. This happens unconsciously. A woman may not sit there thinking, his emotional regulation appears healthy. That's not how attraction works. Instead, she simply feels either tense or relaxed around someone. Her body interprets emotional signals before her mind fully explains them. This is why some men confuse women so deeply. They may look successful on paper, but emotionally, they create unpredictability. One day they're warm and attentive, the next day they're cold and reactive. That inconsistency creates emotional anxiety, and anxiety destroys genuine intimacy over time. One psychologist once described relationships as emotional weather systems. Some people feel like walking into sunlight. Others feel like walking into a storm, where you're constantly preparing for sudden emotional changes. And eventually, people become exhausted by unpredictability. The Stoic perspective teaches something powerful here. Real strength is not emotional suppression. It's emotional control. There's a difference. Suppressing emotions means pretending you don't feel anything. Controlling emotions means feeling deeply without allowing emotions to control your behavior. And women notice this distinction immediately. For example, imagine a disagreement in a relationship. One man becomes defensive, raises his voice, interrupts constantly, and tries to win the argument. Another man stays calm, listens fully, speaks clearly, and refuses to let anger take over the conversation. Which one feels safer emotionally? The answer is obvious. One creates fear and tension, the other creates trust. And trust is what allows intimacy to deepen beyond the surface. A woman once shared a story in a relationship study that perfectly illustrates this dynamic. She said the moment she truly fell for her partner wasn't during a romantic date or grand gesture. It was during a stressful situation at an airport after their flight had been canceled. Everyone around them was frustrated. People were yelling at staff. Anxiety filled the room. But her partner remained calm. He reassured her, solved problems patiently, and never lost emotional control. She said something shifted inside her that night. Not because of what he said, but because of how he handled pressure. That is emotional safety. And this leads directly into a truth many men never hear growing up. Attraction is not only about how exciting you are, it's also about how emotionally safe you feel to someone else's nervous system. This is why emotional maturity becomes increasingly attractive over time. In the beginning of relationships, excitement can create intensity, but long-term connection depends on something deeper. People eventually ask themselves one question: can I emotionally rest around this person? Think about that carefully. Can someone relax around you without fear of judgment, emotional chaos, manipulation, or unpredictability? Because if the answer is yes, intimacy becomes deeper than attraction. It becomes peace. And peace is incredibly seductive in a chaotic world. Now here's where things become even more interesting psychologically. Emotional safety doesn't mean becoming passive or weak. In fact, women often feel safest around men who possess both strength and restraint simultaneously. This combination matters deeply. Anyone can appear aggressive. Aggression is easy. Losing control is easy. But calm strength? That requires self-mastery. A man who can remain composed under pressure sends a powerful subconscious signal. He communicates, I can handle difficult emotions without becoming dangerous, unstable, or emotionally reckless. That signal changes everything. Researchers studying attachment and attraction have repeatedly found that emotional regulation strongly influences relationship satisfaction. People feel more connected to partners whose emotional responses feel predictable and balanced. Why? Because unpredictability activates stress responses in the nervous system. You see this all the time in toxic relationships. One partner constantly walks on eggshells because they never know what mood the other person will be in. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion. But emotional steadiness creates the opposite effect. It allows vulnerability to grow naturally. And vulnerability is where real intimacy begins. Not performance, not manipulation, not games. Vulnerability. This is why some relationships feel emotionally addictive, even without dramatic passion. Two people feel safe enough to reveal their authentic selves without fear of emotional punishment. And ironically, authenticity itself becomes attractive. Think about the moments when you felt most emotionally connected to someone. Chances are it wasn't because they were performing perfection. It was because they were emotionally present. Maybe it was the way they looked at you while you spoke. Maybe it was the calmness in their voice when you were anxious. Maybe it was the feeling that you didn't need to pretend around them. Those moments create emotional memory. And emotional memory is powerful because human beings don't just remember events. They remember emotional states. This is why people often say things like, "I don't know what it was about them, but I just felt comfortable." Comfort may sound simple, but psychologically it's incredibly profound, because comfort means the nervous system stopped preparing for emotional danger. Now let me ask you something important. Have you ever noticed how some people become more attractive the calmer they are? Not boring. Calm. There's a difference. Boring lacks emotional depth. Calmness signals emotional confidence. A calm person doesn't rush to prove themselves. They don't force attention. Their energy feels grounded, and grounded energy naturally pulls people in because it feels rare. Especially today. Modern relationships are filled with emotional noise, constant texting games, validation seeking, emotional inconsistency, attention addiction, social media comparisons, performative confidence. So when someone encounters genuine emotional steadiness, it stands out immediately. And women notice this more than most men realize. Not because women are testing men in some manipulative way, but because emotional awareness has always been connected to safety and connection psychologically. Now here's another layer most people never discuss. Women often observe how a man handles emotions that aren't directly related to romance. How does he treat strangers? How does he react when stressed? How does he speak about people who disappoint him? Can he regulate frustration? Does he become emotionally cold when life doesn't go his way? All of these become signals, because intimacy magnifies character. When people become emotionally close, their real patterns emerge. And this is why temporary attraction can disappear suddenly once deeper emotional exposure begins. Someone may initially appear attractive, but once emotional instability surfaces, the nervous system pulls back. This explains why some women lose attraction after witnessing uncontrolled anger, excessive insecurity, or emotional immaturity. Even if physical attraction remains, emotional trust weakens, and without emotional trust, intimacy struggles to deepen fully. Now here's something incredibly important. Emotional safety isn't built in one moment. It's built through patterns. Consistency matters more than intensity. Anyone can create emotional excitement temporarily, but emotional consistency creates lasting trust. A man who stays emotionally grounded over time becomes deeply attractive because his presence feels reliable. Reliable doesn't mean predictable in a boring sense. It means emotionally trustworthy. And in a world filled with emotional chaos, trust feels rare. This brings us naturally into the second psychological truth about intimacy. Intimacy often becomes a measure of a man's inner strength, but not the kind of strength most people think about. Not physical dominance, not status, not performance. Inner strength reveals itself through emotional composure. And this is where many men unintentionally sabotage attraction without realizing it. Because when emotions intensify, insecurity often becomes visible. Some men start seeking reassurance constantly. Others become overly controlling. Some perform exaggerated confidence to hide anxiety. Others emotionally shut down completely. But true inner strength looks different. It feels calm, grounded, centered. Imagine being around someone who desperately needs approval from everyone around them. Even if they appear confident outwardly, eventually you sense the insecurity underneath. Their mood rises and falls based on validation. Now compare that to someone comfortable in silence, someone who doesn't panic when attention shifts away from them, someone emotionally secure enough to remain themselves without constant reassurance. That difference is powerful, and women feel it immediately. Because emotional certainty creates emotional stability. A man comfortable within himself unconsciously communicates security to others. He doesn't need to dominate every conversation. He doesn't need to prove his intelligence constantly. He doesn't need to seek validation through performance. And paradoxically, that lack of desperation often becomes magnetic. One relationship therapist explained it beautifully. She said insecurity speaks loudly, while confidence moves quietly. That sentence captures so much psychological truth. True confidence rarely needs announcement. It's visible through behavior, through patience, through emotional control, through grounded presence. And during intimacy, those qualities become amplified, because emotionally intense moments expose underlying emotional patterns very quickly. Someone pretending confidence can maintain the mask temporarily, but under emotional closeness, real emotional patterns emerge. This is why intimacy often reveals whether someone truly knows themselves or is simply acting out a role they think others will approve of. And women notice authenticity far more than many men realize. Not perfection, authenticity. Because authentic emotional presence creates trust, and trust deepens attraction far beyond surface chemistry. Now here's where this conversation becomes even more important. Because once emotional safety and inner strength are established, intimacy begins revealing something even deeper: authenticity. And authenticity is rare. Not because people are dishonest intentionally, but because most people spend their lives performing versions of themselves they believe will earn love, approval, or validation. Some perform confidence, others perform toughness, some perform emotional detachment because vulnerability once hurt them. Over time, many people stop asking, "Who am I really?" and start asking, "Who do I need to become so people won't reject me?" But intimacy has a way of dissolving performance. The closer two people become emotionally, the harder it becomes to maintain a mask consistently. Eventually, real emotional habits appear, real fears appear, real insecurities appear, and this is where attraction either deepens or quietly collapses. Because women are often extremely sensitive to emotional inconsistency, a man may say all the right things, but if his energy feels disconnected from his words, something internally feels off. Human beings are wired to detect congruence. We notice when someone smiles while carrying resentment. We notice when someone says, "I'm fine," while radiating frustration. We notice when confidence sounds rehearsed rather than natural. And the nervous system responds to those contradictions immediately. This is why emotional authenticity feels so powerful. It creates alignment between what someone says, what they feel, and how they behave. Think about the people you've trusted most deeply in your life. Chances are, they weren't perfect. They weren't endlessly impressive, but they felt real. You knew where you stood with them. Their warmth felt genuine. Their kindness wasn't strategic. Their attention wasn't conditional. And because of that, your nervous system relaxed around them. This is one reason emotionally mature women often lose interest in performative masculinity over time. At first, confidence and charm may attract attention, but eventually, emotional depth becomes more important than image. Because image cannot sustain intimacy, only authenticity can. A woman once described this beautifully during a psychology interview about long-term attraction. She said, "I stopped caring about how impressive someone looked and started paying attention to how emotionally honest they felt." That statement says everything. Emotionally honest. Not emotionally perfect, honest. And honesty creates emotional intimacy because it removes manipulation from the interaction. For example, imagine two men reacting after making a mistake in a relationship. One becomes defensive immediately. He blames circumstances, avoids accountability, and protects his ego at all costs. The other acknowledges the mistake calmly, apologizes sincerely, and remains emotionally open during the conversation. Which one feels safer emotionally? Which one feels more mature? Which one creates trust? Again, the answer becomes obvious, because authenticity requires courage. It takes strength to remain emotionally real without hiding behind performance. And women often associate this emotional honesty with emotional intelligence. Now here's something deeply important. Authenticity doesn't mean emotionally dumping every thought or feeling onto someone constantly. Emotional maturity still matters. Self-awareness still matters. Emotional regulation still matters. Authenticity simply means your external behavior aligns with your internal reality. You're not constantly pretending. You're not manipulating perceptions. You're not building connection through illusion. And this creates a very different emotional atmosphere in relationships. Because when one person becomes emotionally authentic, it unconsciously invites the other person to relax their own defenses too. This is where real connection begins. Not when two perfect people meet, but when two emotionally honest people feel safe enough to stop pretending. And ironically, this is where attraction often becomes strongest, not during performance, during truth. Have you ever noticed how emotionally memorable certain conversations become? Sometimes two people talk for hours, and afterward, they both feel strangely connected. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the interaction felt emotionally real. No games, no masks, no performance, just presence. And presence is incredibly rare today. Most people are distracted constantly, thinking about what to say next, thinking about how they're being perceived, thinking about their phones, their insecurities, their image, their next move. But emotionally present people feel different. When they listen, you feel heard. When they speak, their attention feels grounded. When silence happens, they don't panic. And psychologically, presence creates emotional intimacy because attention itself is deeply validating. This leads directly into another powerful truth. Intimacy becomes a moment of emotional transparency. In everyday life, people operate through roles: the professional version of themselves, the funny version, the independent version, the socially confident version. But emotional closeness gradually strips those layers away, and that's why intimacy can feel both beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. Because being truly seen is vulnerable. Many women carry emotional memories of moments when vulnerability was mishandled. Times they opened emotionally and were judged, dismissed, manipulated, or emotionally abandoned afterward. So when a woman becomes emotionally close to someone, her nervous system naturally pays attention to how that vulnerability is received. Does he become impatient, dismissive, emotionally careless, or does he remain emotionally present? Because emotional transparency requires trust. This is why a man's emotional reactions matter so much during moments of closeness. Women often observe subtle things men barely notice about themselves. How you react to emotional conversations. Whether you become uncomfortable with vulnerability. Whether you listen calmly or immediately try to fix emotions. Whether your attention remains present or emotionally detached. Whether your body language changes during emotional intensity. All of these become information. And here's something fascinating about psychology. Emotional states are contagious. Researchers call this emotional synchrony. When two people emotionally connect deeply, their nervous systems begin subtly influencing each other. Heart rates synchronize. Tone shifts mirror each other. Emotional energy aligns. This is why calmness matters so much. If you remain emotionally grounded, the other person often relaxes unconsciously too. But if your energy becomes anxious, reactive, or emotionally chaotic, that tension spreads as well. So much of attraction operates beneath conscious awareness. People think they're responding only to appearance or words, but they're also responding to nervous system experiences, to emotional atmosphere, to emotional rhythm. And women tend to be highly sensitive to these relational dynamics. This is why emotionally disciplined men often leave such lasting impressions, not because they're loud or dominant, but because their presence feels emotionally regulating. Think about that phrase carefully. Emotionally regulating. Some people increase your anxiety when they enter a room, others decrease it. Some people make you feel emotionally guarded, others make you feel emotionally safe. That emotional impact shapes connection more than most people realize. And this is why emotional discipline becomes deeply attractive over time. Now let's talk about something many people misunderstand completely: vulnerability. A lot of men hear the word vulnerability and assume it means weakness, emotional collapse, or dependency. But psychologically, healthy vulnerability is actually a form of emotional confidence. Why? Because it requires security within yourself. Someone emotionally fragile often hides constantly behind emotional walls. They fear exposure because their sense of self feels unstable. But emotionally secure people can allow selective vulnerability without losing themselves. And women notice this immediately. For example, imagine a man who never expresses emotion because he's terrified of appearing weak. Over time, emotional distance forms in the relationship. Conversations stay surface level. Emotional intimacy struggles to grow. Now compare that to a man who can express emotion calmly without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. He can communicate honestly while remaining grounded. That balance creates depth. Because true masculine strength isn't emotional numbness, it's emotional steadiness. And this distinction changes relationships completely. A Stoic mindset was never about suppressing emotion entirely. Ancient Stoicism focused on mastering emotional reactions rather than becoming emotionally empty. The goal was clarity, balance, and self-control. And ironically, emotionally balanced men often make women feel safer expressing their own emotions too. Because emotional maturity creates emotional permission. When someone reacts calmly to vulnerability, openness increases naturally. But when someone reacts with judgment, defensiveness, or emotional instability, walls immediately rise again. Now here's another layer few people discuss openly. Intimacy also reveals unresolved emotional wounds. Sometimes people think they're reacting to the current relationship when they're actually reacting to old emotional experiences. A woman who experienced emotional inconsistency in the past may become highly sensitive to unpredictability. A man who experienced rejection may become overly defensive or validation-seeking during closeness. This is why self-awareness matters so much. Without self-awareness, people unconsciously repeat emotional patterns they don't fully understand, and relationships become cycles instead of connections. One woman shared that she used to lose attraction whenever men became emotionally available to her. At first, she thought she simply liked emotionally distant men. But later through therapy, she realized emotional closeness triggered fear because vulnerability once led to pain in her past. That realization changed her relationships completely. Because awareness changes behavior. And this is why emotional intelligence matters more than surface attraction in long-term relationships. Emotionally intelligent people don't just react automatically. They observe themselves. They notice patterns. They ask difficult questions. Why did that trigger me? Why do I shut down emotionally? Why do I seek validation so intensely? Why does emotional closeness make me anxious? These questions create growth, and growth creates healthier intimacy. Now let's talk about the fifth truth because this ties everything together beautifully. Real intimacy requires mutual surrender. Not surrender in the sense of losing power, but surrendering performance, surrendering emotional armor, surrendering constant self-protection. Many relationships fail because both people are trying to maintain emotional control constantly. Nobody wants to look too invested. Nobody wants to appear vulnerable first. Nobody wants to risk emotional exposure. So both people perform confidence while secretly craving emotional closeness. And the result is emotional distance. But deep connection happens when two people gradually stop managing perception and start showing up honestly. That doesn't happen instantly. Trust builds slowly. But eventually, meaningful intimacy asks both people the same question. Can you be emotionally real here? Can you allow yourself to be seen without hiding constantly behind image, ego, or fear? Because real connection begins where performance ends. And this is why emotionally mature relationships feel different from surface-level attraction. There's less anxiety around proving worth, less emotional games, less obsession with appearances. Instead, there's emotional steadiness, mutual respect, emotional presence, psychological safety. And over time, these become more valuable than temporary excitement ever could. Now here's something important for every man watching this to understand. Women are not looking for perfection. They are looking for emotional experience. How do they feel around you emotionally? Safe or anxious? Seen or dismissed? Calm or emotionally exhausted? Connected or emotionally alone? Your emotional presence answers those questions whether you realize it or not. And often, the smallest moments communicate the loudest messages. The way you respond during conflict, the way you handle disappointment, the way you react when things don't go your way, the way you listen when someone feels emotional. Character becomes visible through emotional patterns, and intimacy magnifies those patterns. That's why self-mastery matters so much. Not because relationships are competitions, but because emotionally disciplined people create emotionally healthier relationships. Now, before we finish, I want you to reflect on something personally. Think about the people you felt safest around emotionally in your life. What qualities did they carry? Chances are, it wasn't perfection. It was presence, consistency, calmness, authenticity, and emotional steadiness. Those qualities create trust, and trust creates intimacy. If this conversation resonated with you, comment the word Stoic below so I know you stayed until the end. And while you're there, tell me which truth impacted you the most because I genuinely read through your insights and experiences. These conversations become so much more meaningful when this community shares openly. And if you found value in today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who appreciates psychology, emotional intelligence, and deeper conversations about human connection. Because the more you understand people psychologically, the more clearly you begin to understand yourself. This is Personality Psychology with Teal Swan. Until next time, stay observant, stay disciplined, and keep growing.